So I'm going to start with David on my left.
Right, I'm David Hurd. I'm a speech and language therapist. Once memorably, a very senior linguist in this university said that nothing that I do could possibly be described as linguistics. But I'm interested in language production and language comprehension and language disorders and the representation of language in the brain and things like that. There's language in there, right? But apparently it doesn't count as linguistics. So I'm fraudulently here.
I disagree.
Thank you.
I want to talk about the competence-performance distinction, which, as you all know, dates back to syntactic structures in 1957, and set the project of theoretical linguistics really as being characterizing the intuitions of the ideal native speaker hearer. And you know, the impact of syntactic structures and this program has been absolutely massive. But it's got curious effects to it. Divorces linguistics from almost all sources of data, which might constrain theories, and that it seems to me is a really problematic thing. And it also moved all kinds of things into something external performance, you know, something to do with psychology or memory or something external to linguistics. I mean, my view is that we employ linguistic knowledge in real time to understand and produce sentences in an extraordinary way, and we have clearly mental representations that include syntactic and phonological and semantic and lexical and, you know, lots and lots of verses, which we're able to use extraordinarily well in real time. So for me, you know, linguistics is just a branch of cognitive psychology, really. But also, I think one of the consequences of the competence performance distinction is this poverty of the empirical database. And other things that are to me utterly bizarre. I mean, you know, these multiple center embedded sentences. The man, the woman, a child knows, loves, snores. We're meant to treat as grammatical. But people sometimes say grammatical but unacceptable. I mean, what sort of science is it that says something, a sentence which no one ever produces and no one can understand, is grammatical? I mean, it's just silly. So I think we're going to see this really eroding the idea that the main project is one of characterising the intuitions of the ideal speaker here.
The question for me reminds me of this kind of obsession that I think linguists and perhaps all social scientists have with this binary distinction, you know, and we are fascinated, and if you look at it positively, or we are obsessed rather negatively with binary distinctions. You know, we have competence, performance, we have native speaker, non-native speaker, we have langue, parole, we have grammar, pragmatics, we have monolingualism, multilingualism. You know, we have these two-part distinctions. And I think nowadays there's so many applied linguists, and I have to remind you that my background is as an applied linguist. And I think most applied linguists would define what they're doing in contradistinction to what Chomsky was saying linguists should do. You know, so for an applied linguist, it's all about context, it's all about locality, it's about indeterminacy, it's about contact. And I think some of the new developments in applied linguistics, certainly not all of them, because there's also a kind of reactionary side to applied linguistics, but the side of linguistics that I'm interested in has been looking recently at addressing these linguistic concepts like native speaker, non-native speaker, competence, performance on a very different footing. And certainly the work of people like Alistair Pennycook, Suresh Kanajaraja harks back to the kind of pioneering work of people like Del Hymes in the 1960s, which goes even further back to the work of Bakhtin and J.R. Firth, my namesake from the 1930s, who talks about the need to break up these distinctions of the Saussurean distinction between la langue and parole, for example. So I would say that within applied linguistics nowadays, there's a new sense of what language is really. So that in some ways there are many linguists, those I've just mentioned, applied linguists, excuse me, who would contend that linguistics has got it all wrong. That our perception of language is wrong. That our descriptions of language are misplaced. I mean, certainly Alistair Pennycook, Suresh Kanajaraja, these are senior figures within applied linguistics. Jan Blommerts, a very esteemed professor of applied linguistics, he claims that linguists have got it wrong. Their perception of language, their understanding of the nature of language is wrong. He would say that we, in some ways, imprison ourselves by working with these binary categories, whereas what we should be doing is trying to work with a completely different conceptual apparatus. So, in the last few years, you've had a development of things called metro-linguistics, translanguaging, superdiversity, crossing. These are kind of terms that are meant to establish linguistics on a different footing, a more kind of contact-based footing, which looks at competence not in terms of a particular fixed code or variety, but competence is something which is much more emergent. And at the same time, I think challenging this whole distinction between performance and competence. That in a sense, performance is competence, you might say, to paraphrase Pennycook. So recently, Jan Blommerts, for example, has talked about in future we need to move from talking about language to talking about semiosis. He believes that this whole idea of language is outmoded and outdated. We need to incorporate more understandings of the fact that language is a communicative tool. It's built on on an array of multimodalities. So linguistic description is very impoverished because it copes very badly with being able to capture the complexities and the intricacies of this multimodal, multi-semiotic flow, which we call language, but it's much more complicated perhaps than linguists have hitherto dared to imagine.
Okay.
So yeah.
SJ, do you think performance is competence?
No, I don't. Doesn't matter. I mean, it seems to me that okay, let's take the metaphor of language being a tool for some multimodal whatever. Under that perception, then, it seems to me that what linguistics does, or the kind of linguistics I perform anyway, what linguistics does is examine the tool. What is the tool made of? What does the tool consist of? And it seems to me that one of the questions that certainly generative linguists of my acquaintance are interested in is what are the structures involved? Now, I don't know of any serious formal linguist who has ever said, this is all that language is, these structures. Because it's not. I mean, even Chomsky, going back to syntactic structures, he makes it very clear that what he's looking at are the syntactic structures, but he also makes it clear that there is something else, that there is language use that he is not currently looking at, either for lack of time, lack of interest, it doesn't matter what. But it seems to me that one can make a useful competence performance distinction as long as one doesn't pretend that either competence is all there is or performance is all there is. Because it seems to me that language with a capital L is hugely complex, and it involves both the social and mental, to get back to the second question, I think it has to, Is the competence performance distinction helpful? Depends on what you want. If you want to understand the structures of language, I think the competence performance distinction is helpful. If you want to understand language use as a communicative device, it may be less helpful, but in that case you might want to be focusing on performance, in which case it might be useful to you to forget about the competence business.
So you think that the performance doesn't get you to the structures?
Well, that's right. The performance doesn't get you to the structures, but I would freely admit the structures don't get you to the performance either. So I mean, it seems to me that part of the question is, what is it I'm interested in figuring out? If I'm interested in figuring out turn-taking in some kind of conversation, the structures are going to be basically irrelevant. Who cares? But if that's not the question I'm interested in, then I might care.
Would you agree?
I think I'll start with A. I think whether linguistics and applied linguistics are a hierarchy or a partnership, and like all good academics, I'm going to introduce yet another distinction. Alan spoke to us. Yes, indeed. Alan spoke to us earlier about the evils of binary distinctions. So I'm going to say that it's neither a hierarchy nor a partnership, and perhaps it's a climb. Perhaps it has at least 3 stages on it, and I think that maybe you may want to call these stages linguistics, sociolinguistics, and sociology of language. I don't know where the boundaries are between each of the adjacent pairs there, but I do know that a lot of people don't really think that there are boundaries, at least not ones you can draw very distinctly. I go back again to William Labov, who is, I think we can all agree, is the father of modern sociolinguistics, as most people practice it today. For a very long number of years, he rejected and resisted the term sociolinguistics for his work, because he didn't think there could be any linguistics without a social concept within it. So he was doing linguistics. Everyone was calling it sociolinguistics, and in the end, he said, well, okay, fine, because obviously we have to be able to talk about this. We need some terms in which to do it. So there was already an attempt to get rid of this distinction, and SJ has referred to another one that has come in the last few years. Many more theoretical linguistics theories are being tested with real data, empirical data. This wasn't something that was always felt to be necessary, and now it is, and I say more power to their elbow, really. As to what applied linguistics is and what it is applied to, I think I might have just answered that question. If there is no such thing as sociolinguistics distinct from linguistics, then perhaps what it is applied to is simply the world. I was going to suggest for in the first theme, that if we want to say something about the nature of language, we could say that language is a set of systems, by that I mean formal systems of phonology, syntax and so on, which are applied within a social system of wherever the language happens to be being spoken. So that's what the language is applied to me, the social world. And for that, the final point that's being made in this theme, how important is it that linguistics and language research have practical benefits? That's what my Twitter feed is about, that I was talking about earlier. I find language is a very useful tool for me to understand the world I'm in, but perhaps that's just because of the training that I have. I think it's very fortunate that, as Hannah pointed out earlier, there's a lot of public engagement in linguistics through pop linguistics. However good or bad we think it is, it still means people are thinking about it, and I think that is fantastic. And at that point, I shall give up.
I would like to just pick up on one point, actually, because it relates to some of the things that people in the audience have said. I think that you either carefully or without noticing mentioned a set of systems, and I think that is one part of the big argument about whether we have one system or several systems, what they're made of. And I think that in our daily life we could, or in our research, we could be focusing on very different aspects, and we could be asking different questions that are of interest within applied linguistics or theoretical linguistics, or looking at sociolinguistics or phonology and so on. But if the overarching aim is to try and better understand how language is stored, produced and perceived, then at the end of the day we need to be interested in what each and every single person is doing, what is in the brain, what is produced, what is performed, or what's the competence, because if we have an idea about competence that it processes words first and then adds on later who said them, and then we have very cutting edge cognitive research that shows that actually even at the level of the processing, how we process it matters depending on who said it, then we need to care and we need to start thinking about how all of these aspects interrelate. So, SJ, is what's in your mind some kind of a dictionary version of phonology? And is that a helpful distinction from phonetics, do you think?
Yeah, I think it probably is a helpful distinction. Actually, let's do a thought experiment. And what I'm trying to get at is the distinction between phonetics and phonology here. In our thought experiment, so we're going to do 2 thought experiments. In experiment 1, we've got 2 speakers in a room who have never met each other before. One is from Texas and one is from London. Now, they speak together for 10-15 minutes, and at first it's kind of difficult for the Texan to understand what it is that fellow from London is saying. But after a while, they kind of get to understand, well, he's saying that, but he really means this. And the Londoners, saying, well, this is this fellow from Texas. I suppose if I really try, and I understand what he's trying to say, that I can get my head around it to the extent that we actually start to understand each other. And I would predict, with a little bit of goodwill on either side, that within 15-20 minutes, they will be understanding each other. Within a couple of hours, they'll have very little difficulty understanding each other, with the caveat that they're using the same words. So it's not a question of different words between the 2 dialects. Okay? How are they doing this? Well, it seems to me that they're able to do that because each one is learning to map their phonological structures as native speakers of English to the other person's phonetic output. So that the phonetics of the 2 dialects are very, very, very different, but they share a grammar, a phonological grammar. Okay. Now, thought experiment number 2. You've got the same room, you've got 2 individuals in it. One is from London, the other one's from Paris. The fellow from London doesn't speak any French, never had it in school. The woman from Paris has never heard a word of English apart from when she goes to the cinema. 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, half an hour later, will there be any understanding of what the other is saying? No. There may be communication. There may be hand gestures. Oh, j'ai soif. So the fellow learns to pass her a bottle of water or whatever. So, there can be some communication. But will they, after a day, after 2 days, after a week, will they be understanding each other in terms of language? I doubt it.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. It's very interesting to think about communication in the second example, but not in the first. And my question to you is, how do we know in the first scenario you had whether a lot of the understanding happened because of communication, because we're not looking when we communicate with other people for those underlying invariant structures that we all share, but we're actually looking for meaning all the time, and therefore we need very little cues sometimes, if the context allows, to actually understand what people say.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I suspect that probably with the Texan and the Londoner, there is some bootstrapping there just by trying to understand each other. At the same time, I suspect that after 24 hours, 48 hours, the Texan could say something that, and when I was riding on the ranch and catching them cattle and bringing them back, the Londoner will be able to say what it is that's being described. Is the French person, or is the Londoner going, puis quand je travaillais là-bas, je faisais ça, alors, there's not going to be any comprehension. So I suspect I think you're absolutely right, that there is more to communication than just the language, or more to the whole scenario than just the language. but I think it's pretty striking that in the one case there will be comprehension on more than just the gestural level. In the other case, I think there's unlikely to be, at least without a great deal of time and a great deal of effort on the part of the interlocutors, to be trying to understand the other one's language.
I was also thinking about, in regard to this question, I was flicking through television last night about 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock, and I noticed that the only times that I could hear regional accents, or working class accents as they're called, this is, by the way, is becoming a binary distinction fest, isn't it, tonight? But was on soaps and Big Brother and stand-up comedians, apart from Michael McIntyre. Whereas the documentaries and the history programs and the news programs, they were more standard English. And so, certainly the media reinforces a type of a hierarchy, I guess. About prescriptivism, well, the interesting thing about prescriptivism is that it's absolutely alive and kicking. It has a reality out there in society. There's nothing animates the readers of the Telegraph and the Times like, language errors. And some of the best sellers on the bookshelves are write correctly, speak correctly. You'll still find adverts in magazines now for elocution lessons, despite the supposed popularity of estuary English. And again, we have to ask ourselves as linguists, to what extent do we engage in a public debate where we challenge these myths about, the quality of certain ways of speaking as being, certain languages as being more beautiful based on their linguistic properties. There's all kinds of stereotypical ideas of myths about language that are alive and well in society. And as linguists, we kind of hold back, I think, in many ways, and don't engage as vigorously as we ought to.
Should linguistics be taught in schools? I'm going to say yes, as I think has already been said, but I'm also going to say it already is. On the Twitter feed, which I showed you at the beginning of the session, I'm gratified to see more and more sixth form English language departments following me because of the random observations that I make, which they seem to find interesting. And they always tweet them on to their English language A-level students. So then, I very much hope that no one comes along and debunks me. But then even if they do, that's great, because every so often I tweet something and then someone comes along and says, yes, but there's this other way of looking at it, had you not thought of that? And the answer is I would have done if I hadn't tweeted it just immediately after I saw it. But then I'll retweet the reply, and the sixth formers can also see the answer, and hopefully that helps them. And so there is already linguistics in the schools.
I was struck some time ago. I was looking through a book by Leonard Bloomfield from 1914, and on the first pages of the book he says it's surprising how little even otherwise educated people understand about the scientific study of language. And I'm very, very sad to observe that precious little has changed in the past 101 years in that respect. And I think if we can get linguistics into the schools, that it will do us all a huge amount of good, whether we are linguists or whether we're simply members of a society.
I want to answer the question, what will linguistics look like in 20 years' time? Haven't a clue, and of course I can speculate wildly. I probably won't be here in 20 years' time anyway, to know whether I'm right or wrong. It seems to me that one of the things that's really interesting, and is happening almost independently of linguistics, is we're getting towards the point where you can actually talk to computers and they talk back. And that's something that we've fantasized about for a long time, but it's getting there. And the question is going to be, are they ever going to need any input from linguistics to make this work? And if they don't need any input from linguistics, is that a terrible commentary on how bad linguistics is? Actually, showing us about language. So I think that's one interesting area that we're going to see developing. The other thing I think we're going to start seeing is some serious kind of computational modelling of language in terms even of brain structures. The decade of the brain has been, in my view, pretty disastrous. All we have is lots of studies where blood flow goes up in bits of the brain when people do something. I mean, I'm responsible for quite a lot of things. But on the whole, it's rather uninteresting data because it tells you that there's more blood going to this bit of the brain, not what it's doing with that blood. But I think we'll see some serious computational modelling and serious stuff in relation to the brain, I hope.